Flattening the curve. It's a term that's often thrown around, and I haven't talked about it yet. And it's really quite simple, I would say, and after the talk today, you should be able to understand it as well. So, do you ever wonder why you shouldn't just get this over with? If I'm gonna get it, I might as well just get it now, right? If I'm gonna get it sometime. And I would say, yeah, I mean, if there's no gonna be any treatment for a year and you can't stay indoors the whole time, maybe there's some truth to your logic. Except for the minor detail of the curve. So if you think about the sewage system works very well. I don't know if you know, but there's actually a release valve for the sewage system. That is, when it's raining so hard that it's flooding, the sewers just pour all their stuff out directly into the ocean. That's not what they're designed to do, but they really don't have many options by then. And that's a bad thing, right? So we don't like overwhelming the sewage system, and a classic example is the Super Bowl flush. When there's a break in the Super Bowl and everybody rushes to go to the bathroom all at once. Okay, so let's look at this curve that everybody's talking about. So I have a link there on the bottom to the University of Michigan website, and it shows a blue and a gold because that's their colors. So the concept is there's different shapes of the curve, but the area under the curve, the amount of people that are going to get it, sort of is all the same. You just have a different shape. One is sort of clustered more in the beginning and one is flatter. And this is where the term flattening the curve comes in. So you've heard a lot about ventilators running out, places needing more. In Italy or other places, them choosing who to try to put on a ventilator and who to just sort of let die. Like older people with lots of medical issues, they may just let die. First of all, we don't know if ventilators are the best solution. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for many people, it's sort of the last resort. It's their only chance for not dying. So you want to try to give them a chance to recover, even though that may be low. And a ventilator is that, quote, buying time. We all know we have limited amounts of healthcare resources. I don't know how obvious it is to most people, but hospitals are running pretty full most of the time, at least in the US. And the reason is because most places are for profit. And their goal is to make money, and you don't want to have unused capacity, right? That's not good for making money. In the US, they estimate that we have 2.8 hospital beds per 1,000 people. South Korea has multiple times more. Italy, which is hard hit, has 3.2. China has 4.3. Then there's ICU beds. There's ventilators. There's all these things. But the US is not sort of oversupplied, shall we say. And that philosophy, again, comes into efficiency. So there's some term called just-in-time for programming. And the concept is that you have a big program you're trying to compile. It takes a lot of work to compile the whole thing at once into machine language so the computer can understand it. Why don't you just compile the section you're going to need? Yeah, just do that for now. And later, yeah, you might need another section. We'll take care of that when the time comes. And that's wonderful, well and good, unless all of a sudden you need all the sections, then you're sort of behind. So we need a lot of different supplies in a hospital. So personal protective equipment we've talked about before. Ventilators don't just sort of run themselves. We need respiratory therapists. They're the ones that doctors usually work with adjusting the ventilator. And with my training, oftentimes the doctor himself wouldn't actually adjust the ventilator. He'd tell the respiratory therapist what to do, and the respiratory therapist would do it because they're sort of possessive and protective about their ventilators. But because we're having limited amounts of ventilators, and you can't just magically make them appear out of thin air, maybe we're trying new things. In the US, not so much, but definitely in other countries. And we're figuring out maybe a ventilator is not the best way to go. The problem is we learned that there are certain criteria that somebody should be ventilated for. But as we all know and we've learned, criteria don't mean much, especially in the face of a new disease. Old rules need not apply. The other thing is, well, if you're trying to conserve ventilators, you might as well just give it a shot, see if you could do something. And there's other things that we call sort of advanced measures, but we don't call them ventilation or intubation, where you literally stick a tube down somebody's throat. And so the other common things, first of all, many times people just need some oxygen. You could put oxygen on the face in different ways. So first of all, there's the nasal cannula that goes through the nose. There's a face mask that goes through the face. There's something we call a non-breather. It's like has a little bag here, and the idea is you could actually increase the concentration up to even say 100% to try to get them more oxygen. But what those lack is pressure. So there's two things that we sort of need. One is to getting the air in. So if somebody's not breathing, say they've overdosed, well, you could give them a lot of oxygen, but they're not breathing. They'll flow in by diffusion, but that takes an awfully long period of time. So you need some way to physically force it in. And there's two main measures that we have. One is called high flow nasal cannula, and one is called Bipap. So high flow nasal cannula is where they put things in your nose, but they're a bit thicker, and they can run air a lot faster than the normal thing coming out of a wall. So this thing can maybe do 60 liters per minute, which is a lot of air when normally it's a few liters per minute, right? Because the thing is, this has a much sort of bigger tube, so you could push a lot more air, and it has a little separate machine instead of just plugging it into the wall. It provides a little bit of pressure because the air is flowing so quickly, but not very much. The other thing is called Bipap or bi-level, but it's the idea, if you ever know what a CPAP machine is, you have a CPAP machine, which is a mask where it goes in your nose and just pushes air in. It's a continuous pressure. CPAP, continuous pressure. And so Bipap is bi-level. It has two settings. And so it has two levels of pressure. It's not actually sucking air out of you. It just has one pressure that's higher than the other pressure. Just there's a difference in flow, right? Because flow is all depending on a pressure gradient. Even though it's still more pressure than you have just from the air around us, it's still moving in and out. And so this is usually a full face mask. Has to be fit very well. There's this concept of called an air leak. It has to leak a little bit somewhat. And if the mask doesn't fit well, oftentimes it gets into your eyes. Definitely could cause a lot of trauma over your nose. And we were taught certain things like you can't be on this for a long time because they can't eat, right? They can't take medications because they have stuff flowing into their mouth. It'd be dangerous. But you know, times are different now. Maybe we're trying for longer. But then sometimes you still just need a ventilator if they really can't do it. So you have to have some consciousness to do these things, and if you're just out, then yeah, I mean, there's not much of a point. So a ventilator is they shove a tube down your throat. And so it goes into your lungs. It bypasses your neck and your mouth. So it gets rid of a lot of this resistance issue because there's a lot of stuff in between your lungs and the outside air. And you don't have to worry about them breathing or not, being conscious or not, because this machine will breathe for them. You have a rate or a backup rate set up. So it will give them a certain amount of breaths. And there's also something called PEEP. And it's the idea that you have this pressure at the end that you don't release. Right? So when we breathe in and out, presuming we're normal and our lungs function normally, we sort of exhale all the air that's in our lungs. We actually could test that to see how much you exhale, but most of us are pretty good. Now, if you've been smoking for a long time, you have other forms of lung disease, maybe you're not. Sometimes they keep us a small amount of air in. And actually, sometimes we think it's good because it keeps those little airways from collapsing. In terms of the lung physiology or the anatomy, so we have the trachea, the big windpipe coming in, and it branches off into bronchus. They go into smaller things called bronchioles, and at the very end, they have very small little bubbles called alveoli. Alveolus is singular, alveoli is plural. And the idea is that, you know, a lot of times when you're sick, you don't breathe deeply. Say you have a pneumonia, those little things at the bottom can collapse. And we think in the case of this coronavirus, many times they get filled with fluid. And so it'd be wonderful to keep sort of pushing air in, trying to open these things up, right? But it's very hard to get air down in there. And so that's actually one of those things why you have to have somebody with a certain amount of intelligence managing these settings. Because the idea is that if you push a lot of pressure in all of a sudden, sort of like when you're bagging somebody, if you look at these, basic life, sort of algorithms, or ACLS as well, advanced cardiac life support, they tell you to do it slowly. And the idea is if you push a lot of pressure in all at once, it's not going to actually get all the way into the small airways because of the way physics work. It's going to be great at expanding those large airways, but those are filled with cartilage, sort of like our nose or ear. They're not going to collapse. The small airways are the ones we're worried about. We're trying to get the air all the way down in there. So when we talk about flattening the curve, we're talking about preserving resources, right? We're talking about making that peak not go as high. If you look again at that, University of Michigan graph, how many very sick people the hospital can treat? We have limited capacity, and we're trying to maintain a level of sick people below that capacity so we can handle them. And actually, if you think about other things we've encountered recently, they're also about flattening the curve. We just don't use that term. So the toilet paper shortage. I don't know if where you are has a toilet paper shortage, but this was in Asia. This was viral in Asia long before it happened in America. In fact, some of my friends in America didn't even know about it till recently. He's like, my friend said he went to Trader Joe and he says, yeah, it's pretty normal except there's no toilet paper. And he asked the cashier, and she went on this rant about how, when she was stocking, this mom came over and just grabbed as much as she could, and she had children, and they grabbed as much as they could. But the idea is that a lot of people were scared that, because a lot of toilet paper comes from China, that they were going to run out in Hong Kong. And so they went out and bought all the toilet paper. And in fact, there was people stealing toilet paper. A man, robbed others, sort of like when they were restocking at a grocery store, with a knife and ran away with like 600 rolls. But the issue is there's actually no shortage of toilet paper. But actually there is. Well, what the manufacturers say is there's no shortage. We have plenty of supply. But what the local people say is there is a shortage. How does that work? Well, there's enough elsewhere, but there is not enough here. Yeah, so there's still a lot in the warehouses, but you can't get them all of a sudden to the store that just ran out of their week's supply in a few hours. And the issue is similar to what's happening with the ventilators in the US. It seems like right now we started ramping up and there may be enough. Well, depends where you are. There may be in short supply in some places and enough in other places, and we don't have teleportation yet. Supplies don't magically redistribute themselves. And it seems like that's what's already happened in the world with food. We already talked about food long time ago, about, running out of food. Everybody's worried about food. They say, no, you have plenty. And it seems like in the US, we do have plenty. But there's other parts of the world that may not have plenty. And if you actually calculate the amount of food in the world that exists per person, it's plenty. But we just know that it's not equally distributed. Many times, some people have a lot and some people have none. And unfortunately, usually the poor people have not enough. In California, when we had a drought, the governor tells you to conserve, the mayors tell you to conserve, they ban watering, they ban washing your cars at home, etc. But life was pretty normal for most people, I would say. Well, most people I know. In northeastern California, it's much poorer. A lot of the eastern side of California is like a different world than the west side of California, where you have Silicon Valley, the Southern California area, including Hollywood, Orange County, which is one of the richest counties, San Diego. And actually some of these places had no running water anymore. Isn't that ridiculous? So the idea of staying home, not going out, is twofold. One is you may have no symptoms, but you may still, unfortunately, be passing it on to other people. And in that sense, you're harming other people who may not have the resistance you have. The second thing is, if you yourself get sick and go to the hospital, you are increasing this curve, which may exceed the capacity of the hospital, and then they're going to start having to make decisions about who to care for and who not to. And in the US, we don't know how to deal with that. We don't want to deal with that. That's not a good thing. So this is a simple explanation of flattening the curve and how it applies to the coronavirus pandemic.